Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Closing Wednesday keynote at Ditto World. My name's Sarah O'Keefe, and I'm here to talk to you about closing the gap between design content and XML content, or perhaps marketing and technical content. So by way of a little bit of background, I run a company called Scriptorium, which is based largely in North Carolina, and we optimize product and technical content operations for large global companies. In the course of that, we've done a ton of work in XML, DITA, CCMSs in general, and AEM XML specifically. So I put together a very extra sophisticated agenda for you. I want to talk about why there's a gap and hopefully prove to you that in fact there is a gap, and then talk about the fact that this is a problem and that we need to close it. So when we start talking about integrating marketing and technical content, from a technical point of view, from a software point of view, this has been solved. When you look at an AEM-based stack with the AEM XML add-on, we can build out our regular, if you will, website content, the big .com marketing content over on the AEM side. We can put all our structured DITA content into the AEM XML side, and then we can push that from AEM XML over to AEM regular, and integrate, combine, make them look consistent, and do all sorts of fun stuff. And you've seen a couple of demos of this already over the last couple of days. So from a technical point of view, we're good. And you would say, well, then, why are we here, right? And the problem is that the hard work is actually just getting started, because although we have a technical solution, we're really bad at this. People are not good at combining these two things. So then I guess we ask the question, do we really have to do the work? Why don't we just leave them separate and not integrate them and declare victory and go home? Right? And so the unfortunate reality is that we do in fact have to close this gap. And there is in fact a business reason for this above and beyond just it looks dumb, right? So this is what we see when we think about our websites or our content properties, whatever those may be, right? Oh, we have this main site and it's an AEM, and then we have a docs subsite, maybe it's docs.xyz.com or xyz.com/docs or library.xyz.com, whatever. And maybe you're building that by hand and putting up a bunch of sort of custom created HTML. We've got a knowledge-based site, which lives in some sort of support knowledge-based software. And then you've got a lovely dev portal that's using, Markdown and GitHub or something like that. Okay. So from my point of view and yours inside the organization, this is just reality. And, they look maybe they look related, but they don't look identical. And sometimes they don't look related, which is really problematic. So here's the problem. The problem is that as far as your customers are concerned, you have one website. They don't care about all of our internal problems, right? They don't care about the inconsistency. They just think of you, the organization, as this big monolith with content. And they're not really interested in all that stuff over on the left. So the customers are completely uninterested in our organizational structure, in our org chart, in the fact that software A is incompatible with software B. They don't care. And what's worse is I'm showing you 5 little, site variants here. And I'll point out a couple of things here that do not match reality. Aside from the fact that they're tiny and, faked wireframes. Number one, they all look kind of the same. That is not my experience with these sites. What'll happen is they barely look related. Maybe if we're lucky, they're using the same logo, if we're really lucky, but not always. And also, having only 5 of them, I've seen 20, 30, 50 different web properties, all running on different technology, all running on different systems. It is a hot mess. So this is bad because our customers don't care, and they're not interested in you saying to them things like, oh, you couldn't find that. Well, you were in the KB, but you needed to be on the dev site. And, if you go to the dev site and you twirl around just right and you sacrifice the chicken and you do some other stuff, you'll find the content you're looking for. No, they no longer like you. So the problem is that we have to present a seamless experience. And if we don't present a seamless experience, well, then our customers hate us. And if our customers hate us, bad things tend to happen in terms of, user retention, new customers, sales, social media reputation, market share, stuff. So what does this actually mean? I mean, when I say seamless experience, what does that mean? Well, seamless UX for customer-facing content. And I want to be very clear here because sometimes we get into this, well, what's our internal email strategy? Or what's our internal document management strategy? That, not my department, right? I care about the customer-facing content, the information that your customers have access to, whether on a public site, in a printed book, if you're doing those, or anywhere else that they can go. Let's say you have customers and you have information behind a login, which is fine. Sometimes you need to do that. But customer-facing content is the information that is available to your customers that matters to them and has to do with them buying, using, enabling, provisioning, supporting, training on your product or your products. So seamless UX means you have to have consistency across all this stuff in design and search and terminology and taxonomy and probably some other things, but this is a start. And the thing is, every single one of these bullets is really, really, really hard work. Now, the AM XML combination can solve the design and the search issues, right? Because if I have a design standard set up on AM and I take my XML content, push it over to AM, then I can use that common design for all of my content. So I can kind of, to a certain extent, check off the design question. Now, you need a good design, and you need a design that accommodates all the content types you're working with, which I'll talk about in a minute. Terminology, you just heard a really great presentation from Val and Regina Lynn on all the things you have to do in terminology. I'll touch briefly on a couple of these, but that's work you have to do in the content itself. There's no magic bullet for that one. And then for taxonomy, you have to do the work to actually think about your taxonomy, your structure, your classification systems, and then you can use your AM XML stack to manage and enforce that taxonomy usage. So, what does that really mean? Well, you can present your content in very different ways depending on what you're trying to do. And so here you have an example of, bulk spices and packaged spices. And in fact, even with the packaged spices, I'm showing you something that's considered, relatively higher end. It's not something you're going to find actually if you just go to the grocery store and walk down the spice aisle. So these two things are presented and packaged differently because people are looking for them differently. Maybe they're buying in bulk, they're buying by weight, not by volume or, per bottle. So you probably have different audiences here and different motivations. And if you want to bring these things somehow into alignment, you need to really understand what's going on here. What's the right packaging and the right presentation for what you're trying to do? So what will happen is that you're going to discover that your content is fragmented across your organization with lots of different design and search and technology layers and all the rest of it. You have almost certainly toolset silos, and you have groups who have different priorities for what they're trying to do. One of the best parts about something like this presentation is that you can actually smell what you're buying. You can go in there and get a good whiff of what it is. Whereas when you have something in a nice, tidy bottle with a lid on it, you can't really smell it. So it's a different experience, not better or worse, but different. So who is your buyer? How do they consume your content? Do they want you to kind of pre-package it and make it nice and digestible and small things and give you a package of these are all the spices you need for baking if you're more of a beginner? Or do you want to go and pick out exactly what you want and make your own blend? And I've now, I think, beaten this metaphor to death, but I want to talk a little bit about design-first content, which is typically marketing, and XML-first content, because I think you see the same difference in perspective when you think about these content types and the people that are creating and consuming them. So marketing. This is a super basic example of what marketing is and what it looks like. I apologize to all the professional marketers ahead of time, and I will pre-apologize to the tech writers who are going to be on the next page, because what I'm showing you here is the incredibly oversimplified version, and I'll also note that this is artwork at a level that I could achieve. So in marketing, typically, what you're going to have is smaller messages. And messages tend to be grouped into campaigns, but you have these smaller messages, and the message itself gets personalized and pushed to different people based on their context or their demographics. And so one example of this is I was working on a project a couple of years ago, and we had some personalization discussions, and the personalization guy who was there was talking about how people use website content differently depending on what time they're logged into this particular website. And what it boiled down to was if they're there during working hours, they're looking for content to support their work. You know, how do I do this thing? Or tell me more about this concept that I need to understand as a professional, whatever it was. But after hours, at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and we realize now, you know, in COVID, this example sounds dreadfully old-fashioned, and actually I'd be curious to see if their perspective on this has changed. But after hours, at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, typically when people look things up, they're looking it up because they are trying to do professional development. So it's not, I'm trying to get my job done. It's more like, I want to read about this because I need to understand it because maybe in the future I need this for, you know, my next job or my promotion. So the search patterns were very different, and what they actually wanted to do was present different information to their website visitors based on time. Well, time is time. I'm on the East Coast in a certain time zone. If you're in Europe, you're 5 or 6 hours ahead. If you're in Asia, or India, you're 9.5 hours ahead. If you're in China, you're 12 hours ahead. So it's not that it's 8 p.m., you know, on the website. You have to look at, is it 8 o'clock at night for a given person at their locale? So this gets actually very, very tricky, very fast, and I learned a lot, and I thought it was cool. But think about this personalization, usually based on some sort of demographic, something you know about the customer or that website visitor. Now, technical content does usually almost exactly the opposite thing. What you do with technical content, much more likely, is you push an enormous amount of content to the website, tens of thousands of pages of topics, of pieces of content, and then you give your website visitors a way to search and filter and navigate to find that one piece of information that they're looking for. Because when they show up on your doorstep looking for technical content, it's probably because they have a problem. I need to do a thing and I don't know how, right? Whereas if it's more marketing targeted, more pre-sale targeted, it's more like, hey, let me tell you about our cool product. Now, again, I'm very much oversimplifying for the purposes of this presentation, but the paradigm of we're going to push content on you based on what we know about you versus you're going to pull content based on what you identify in your filters, right? You're going to filter and then you get a reasonable set of results and then you click on one and that's the thing that you're going for. So these are literally in opposite directions in terms of how this is working. And so as a marketing person, I tend to think about campaigns, messages going to millions of people, but each message is kind of handcrafted and tweaked and adjusted and adapted based on, oh, you're in this time zone, or oh, you're a director versus you're a VP versus you're an entry-level intern. You get different kinds of messaging, and there's kind of a push. TechCom broadly is all these pages in a library, and you get to pull. So the relative volume of content that we're talking about on the TechCom side, the number of unique pages is actually much, much higher. But the number of things being pushed on the marketing side might be higher, right? Because you have millions of messages going out, but it's one message or one customized message or a couple of customized things. So we have these two groups with just extraordinarily different ways of looking at content. Now, the XML teams usually are responsible for some sort of a docs subsite, some sort of a docs website or subdomain. They're accustomed to a component content management system of some sort, perhaps. They are really interested in templates and automation, right? Because in order to manage this huge volume of stuff, you have to get throughput. You have to get content velocity. So the main metric, just big picture, the main metric that we see out of XML teams is in fact something like content throughput. How fast can we push this content out the door? And faster equals better, right? Most of you, I think, are DITA people, or at least familiar with DITA. And if you look at the beginnings of DITA 15 years ago, the number one argument for DITA was efficiency. We can automate formatting. We can do stuff faster. We'll have reuse. We'll have reuse and translation. We can speed things up. And that's this mentality, right? We have so much stuff. We just need more efficiency, because if we don't have more efficiency, we can't do it. So the design teams probably are responsible for the main website, the .com. They're accustomed to using a web CMS of some sort. They may have design systems or frameworks, but if you look at that, that's kind of a big new thing in the last couple of years. The design gets priority over, I think, a lot of other things. You'll see people saying, oh, you need to make that text shorter. It's not going to fit in the space I've allotted for it. And if it gets bigger, it's going to do bad things to my page or website design. And the main metric is content engagement. Do people read the snippet of content or look at it or watch the video or whatever, and then take further action? That's totally, totally different from how fast can I produce my content, right? So again, got these two groups, they don't talk to each other. And then you've got these design challenges, right? So on the design side, the marketing page designs don't necessarily work particularly well for technical content. We've seen this over and over again where our technical content needs figure captions. And okay, we're willing to discuss whether they should be numbered or not, but we actually do legit need captions. And there's no accommodation for that in the Marcom designs. I have had ongoing problems with font choices. Now, I can hear you from here. I know you're all muted, but I hear you all screaming, but what about Unicode? And you're absolutely right. But what I'm talking about is teams that choose a custom font handcrafted by a designer in Berlin, and I really wish I was making this up, who produced this lovely looking font that was custom for that particular client. And when they went back and said, so can you do a variant so that we can produce content in Russian? So we need Cyrillic. And he said, no, I only work on Latin alphabets, go away. And this was a global company, of course, and we're not even talking about the fact that they had huge clients in China and Japan and Thailand and all these other places, right? They made this beautiful font that would work for English and I guess German and probably French and Italian and Spanish. Nobody thought about anything beyond, the baseline Latin alphabet for reasons that escape me, because this was not a long time ago. That approach, that lovingly handcrafted approach just does not work at scale. It works great when you're doing small amounts of content. It doesn't work at scale. So we have one group who's totally focused on scale, right? And we have one group that's totally focused on make it beautiful. Again, over-exaggerating, apologies to everybody. On the XML side, the TechCom side of the world, we have a couple of other problems. The bar for this looks good enough is, in my non-designer, terrible at doing layout opinion, far too low. I have seen some terrible designs. I mean, they put out these data sheets and they're awful. I mean, they're not just ugly, they're hard to use and hard to follow. And who came up with this idea of laying them out this way? And what were you thinking? Because I'm not a designer, but even I can tell this is terrible. And also, I'll point out that 95% of the time, those extra terrible designs were actually done in InDesign. So it's like, you have this wonderful, powerful tool, and you did this. And they're like, yeah, isn't it great? No, it's not great. Terrible. So the design standard is very, very low. Not for everyone. And there are definitely some exceptions to this, but I've seen some just horrific stuff. There's no, I shouldn't say there's no accountability, but the TechCom side of the world doesn't have a lot of metrics. There's not really this culture of we're going to measure who's looking at our stuff and how many hits we're getting and where the hits are going and what the search looks like. We've made some progress in this area, but that laser focus on engagement, if this content isn't engaging people, if we're not getting engagement, it's worthless. That perspective hasn't really come to the TechCom side. Now, arguably, we have other issues on the TechCom side, like regulations and the need to follow regulatory rules and, not get sued and not get shut down by regulatory bodies. But in addition to that, there's not a lot of accountability for metrics. The TechCom groups in general tend to be risk averse, which I think, again, ties into, well, when you're regulated, you tend to be risk averse. So I think that's, it's a challenge, but it's also a legitimate priority. And over, we've seen people bound into legacy formats, especially PDF. But I mean, Chum, we're getting requests. Our Chum files aren't working. Well, yeah, I mean, they were deprecated like 10 years ago. Well, we still need Chum because then we take the Chum file, we run it through this weird process with a custom thing, and then we do this other thing, and then we produce, and it's like, okay. So legacy formats are a huge problem. They need to be gotten rid of, but getting rid of them is, in fact, expensive, right? So, and TechCom is not known for getting funding. So those are kind of the challenges we see on the XML slide. And broadly, TechCom docs are random access, right, via search. And they are because people are trying to learn something, or there's a product design issue. They can't figure out how to use the product, so they go read the doc. Or the product is big and complicated, so you need to go read the doc. Marketing campaigns more so tend to be sequential, personalized based on user characteristics and trying to align with the customer journey. So, those are not the same. You just look at the slide and they are not the same at all. But we need to close this gap, right? Because if we don't, we look like 15 different companies that are sort of kind of under the same umbrella, but not really. So how do we close it? And the answer here, I'm deeply afraid, is yet another 5-step maturity model. There's a more detailed discussion of this on our website, and my coworker Elizabeth is in the chat. She's going to drop that link in for you. But basically, this is holistic, so enterprise content strategy. And in order to close the gap between the design focus and the XML focus, what we're going to have to do is move up this maturity model. And I think, based on the work that we've been doing for the past, say, 10 or 15 years, that the key that differentiates your level of maturity is content integration, how well you're integrated with the other groups in your organization that are also producing customer-facing content. So probably you're here at level 1. That's okay, because to be very clear, it was until very, very recently quite hard not to be there, quite hard to be not in these silos, right? Because the technology for doing integration is relatively newer. And we don't move that fast. I mean, none of us do because we have these huge content operations. So, siloed means that every content type is developed and deployed separately, probably on a different stack and probably without any integration of the actual authoring teams. They may not even know who they are. Like you might not even know your counterpart. So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like. Like, what are your action items to move up the maturity model? And these are probably in order-ish. You could do some of these out of order, but this is sort of broadly the 5 steps that you need to take, and they don't quite map, right, because you start at level 1. So you kind of move your way up the maturity model. I'll talk about each one of these, but before I do want to point out that your life will be really a lot easier if you have an executive who's responsible for all of your content. Whether that's a chief content officer or it's the chief marketing officer, but all the content groups report to the CMO, or it's the CTO or the VP of engineering and all the content groups report to that person. Those things are all great, but having one is a big, big plus. And if you don't have one, think about a cross-functional working group and really, really think about where you're going to get your authority and your funding, because those are the two things you're going to desperately need. And your life will be a lot easier if you have an advocate. Your life will be easier if that advocate is higher up the food chain, and your life will be really easier if your advocate is, for example, the CEO of your company. That's super helpful. So see if you can make that happen. Just in general, we're not saying that anybody's wrong. What I'm actually saying is that doing things inconsistently is worse than doing them consistently and badly, right? Consistency is the key here, because if your customers have consistency, they can get used to whatever not so great experience you're feeding them. Now, ideally, of course, we want to give them a really great experience and be consistent, but kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And we need to consolidate across the organization, whether it's actually consolidating all the teams or just forging connections and having them talk to each other. So step one here is to talk a little bit about terminology. And again, they did a great job on this, so I will refer you to the wonderful presentation on terminology by Val and Regina. But basically, it actually doesn't matter whether you say killer whale or orca. What matters is picking one. What secondly matters is not to use jargon or alternative terms. Establish a standard for the collective noun. So it's a pod of orcas or a pod of killer whales. I don't really care whether you say orca or orcas for the plural, but I care a lot about you picking one and always using that one. So you need terminology standards, and you need them across the organization. And then you need, as they said, to move those terminology standards over to all your languages. I did a quick search here, and look at what happens when you ask the dictionary for the German word for killer whale starting from killer whale versus from orca. It actually gives you a different set of words in different order. I personally am partial to Mörderwal, which means exactly what it sounds like. But, you know, pick one, and then you can be consistent from there. Your translators don't stand a chance of consistency because of this issue, right? If you use orca half the time and killer whale the other half the time, they will accordingly translate differently. And now you have two words in German, which you did not intend. Similarly, you're going to need a taxonomy and a metadata strategy. Again, this is, if there are taxonomists and ontologists out there, I am so sorry. A taxonomy basically is a classification system for your content. So things like product family and product variants and add-ons and audiences and some other basic things like that. Your classification system probably is the foundation for your faceted search, so that people can, you know, select things and narrow down what they're looking for. It helps you categorize and organize your content. And every content type actually has some different taxonomy requirements. So if you think about the personalization that the marketing team needs, they need metadata or taxonomy for that. The TechCom team probably needs some pretty nitty-gritty stuff around product variants, around this piece of content is only relevant in the European Union because of regulatory issues, that kind of thing. So you need different kinds of taxonomy and metadata depending on where you are. So personalization, if you take demographic information and then you have tagged content, you can get to personalization. On the TechCom side, usually or often, personalization is driven by a role or a product line or licensing. So you have users and they have a login on your site, and you know what software or what hardware or what products they have bought from you. And based on what they've bought from you, you present them with different kinds of information. Or based on knowing that they're a beginner, you give them different kinds of information. Or based on their language preference, you give them different information, right? So there's some overlap here, but generally the marketing teams are more interested in sort of profiling and personalization. And the TechCom personalization is usually based on what people have bought or are known to be interested in, perhaps. But there's kind of, again, a difference, sort of a product-focused versus a person-focused perspective. All right, so terminology and taxonomy. You need a consistent UX. So the user experience across the board for all of your content needs to be consistent. That means that the design-focused teams need to develop and publish standards, whether that's design systems, design frameworks, HTML standards, brand identity. They're called lots of things. I don't care, but they need to be developed and published. And the XML teams need to take their structured content and map it to these design standards and get it to work. This usually works pretty well. The big issue that we run into here is that if you have a design organization, and actually this happens on the TechCom side too, it's the exceptions. Oh, well, I do it that way most of the time, but, just this once I want to turn the paragraph red just because I like red and it looks nice. Or just this once, I want to tweak this, or I don't like this page break or whatever. That is a non-starter at scale, right? Thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages, you simply can't do it. And so that conversation needs to happen early on. Give us a framework, give us something pretty flexible, and we will flow our huge volumes of content into it. At the same time, we're going to continue to produce this super ugly thing because it's fast and efficient is also a non-starter. So these two need to kind of meet in the middle and have a conversation about what constitutes good design and what constitutes scalable design that will meet the needs of both teams. Now, as you start doing this, what you're going to discover is that actually unifying the authoring and publishing systems would save you, I want to say billions of dollars, maybe not billions, but so much money. Because let's say you have two different technology stacks, not 27, just two, and you're trying to keep them in alignment. So I want the stuff that I push out of system A to look like the stuff I'm pushing out of system B. That is really, really hard to do, and it's really hard to match exactly, and then you run into these problems with like the search isn't working over the top of the two of them. So when you start looking at unifying authoring and publishing, what you're going to do is try to reduce the number of systems you have and or start connecting systems. And this is where AEM and the AEM XML add-on are basically a transformative solution for what you're trying to do. Because you take AEM for all the design-first content and for the main website, and then you take the AEM XML add-on for the structured product content, but you push the structured content over to regular AEM using site generation, which I think somebody showed us in another presentation, and then you use all the design work that's already been done there for your XML content. You can also, if you need to, combine them, but as a first step, you just put them together. So that looks something like this. Right, you have AEM generating your main.com, and then in the olden days, in the bad old days, you had DITA, and you had some sort of a DITA publishing workflow, and then you have Markdown over there sitting in a dev portal, right? So this is three systems, and you could have, again, 20 on this slide without any sort of exaggeration. So AEM plus AEM XML basically means we're going to do this. We're going to unify the AEM and the DITA pieces and put them together. I'm not showing this here, but you could also take your Markdown content and run it through DITA and push it out to the dev portal, and thus have essentially three kinds of source and one unified pipe that you're pushing all the content through, which means you'll get a unified look and feel on the front end for all three of these. So, omnichannel, when we talk about omnichannel, what I usually mean is you're writing content or text or audio or video or something, and you shouldn't be hard coding things. I don't know about you, but I have a Kindle and I read a lot of trashy books on my Kindle and occasionally some good ones. And how many times have you been reading a book where all of a sudden in the middle of the book, for no reason, there's a word that's hyphenated, like in the middle of a line, it just, there's a hyphen. Well, that's because somewhere along the way when they did the print version, somebody typed in a hyphen to make, a print page look better. And then they never took it out when it went over to Kindle, and now it's sitting smack in the middle of one of my lines and annoying me. So you don't hard code hyphens. There are other ways of doing that. Fonts, you shouldn't hard code your fonts and then expect them to work on every single platform. Some of us are getting a little older and we need a little bigger font, and it makes us very cranky when you make your text tiny for your 22-year-olds. Line breaks are a problem. Channel-specific language on the next page, click here, those kinds of things. You want to be careful with those. I've had people ask me if we couldn't just please embed some chunks of custom HTML and just pass it through. And well, yes, we can, but please let's not, right? This is a terrible idea. Custom chunks of HTML are the devil. You should not do it. So a new design perspective that's really focused on best practices and really clean markup, just really clean development. You need templates, you need frameworks. You can't do this ad hoc, because if you do, you'll end up doing the work and then doing the work again, and then doing the work again in your target languages, and then doing the work again in the other languages, and then you made an update and oops, you have to do it all again. I don't know about you. I don't enjoy doing this stuff over and over again. I want to do it once, get it right, and let it go out into the world. So templates and frameworks are your friend. We're going to need them. All right, we need to think about content strategy in product design. Now, what I mean by this is that at the phase where your product, whatever it is being developed, somebody needs to be thinking about content strategy. So you're making a piece of software. Okay, software has error messages. Error messages need to be translated when you localize your software into lots of languages, which you're going to do because you're going to be super successful. So where are you going to put those error messages such that the content people will have access to the error messages, can write them well and correctly in your first language, and can efficiently swap them out for all the other languages that you're going to need in the future? Speaking of languages, what countries are you planning to sell this product to? What does that look like from a content requirement point of view? Are there different requirements for your content based on what countries you're going to? And I don't just mean we have to translate. Absolutely. But what about currency? What about different designs? What about different cultural expectations? You want to be very, very careful in certain countries about making references to alcohol. They're cute and kind of juvenile in the US. In other countries, they're highly, highly problematic. If you don't want to be cute and juvenile and or highly problematic in some countries, you might want to think twice about those kinds of references. But the product design phase is going to be, okay, we're creating this product. These are the content products that will go with it. How are we going to do that? If you have hardware, and especially if you have hardware that is regulated, you're going to have to think about labels, warning labels, like don't put your hand here, pinch point, those kinds of things. Those regulations vary by country. So you have to make sure that they're covered. You have to make sure that they are provided, they're the right color, they're the right localization. Is the German version of this label going to fit onto the space that you've allotted in an appropriate size font that I can read? Not. What features are you going to campaign on? What are the top features of this product? How will you deliver those, right? So I think it's really important when you get to this higher level of maturity that the product design discussion, what is this product? How big will it be? What does it do? Who are we going to sell it to? Includes what is our content strategy for this product? What is the content we need? What is the content we're going to do? How are we going to do this? And then I want to touch on languages. I've talked about this a little bit, but languages are not a channel in Omnichannel, right? It's not just, oh, push a button and now we'll have German or French or Italian or Spanish or Chinese. You can do a little bit of grouping. You will hear very often FIGS, French, Italian, German, Spanish, and CJK, which is Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And a lot of times those languages kind of get grouped together, or broadly the Western European languages go in one bucket, and then you've got some East Asian languages, and then you've got some others. But you need to think about terminology for your languages. For every single language that you're delivering on, you need to think about terminology. You need to think about design. Now, the obvious example of this is always that if you're doing right to left languages, Hebrew, Farsi, Arabic, you will need a different design than if you're doing left to right. And you can't really just mirror the design. To a certain extent you can, but not 100%. So you need to think about your design. And then there are some design expectations. When you pick a font, now setting aside the bespoke font with no glyphs in it, when you pick a font, you know, that font says something about you, right? I mean, it's very formal. I mean, just think about what it would mean to deliver your content in Comic Sans, right? We probably don't do that. So the font says something, and it has a certain vibe to it. But that message that you're trying to send with the font is incredibly culturally specific. So if you pick something that says a certain something in North America, it doesn't necessarily say the same thing, even when it's the same font in Europe. So you really have to think about that. From a design point of view, I picked on German a lot, but you know, German infamously expands when you translate. All the words are really, really long. But you have to account for that. You have to make sure that you will allow for text expansion and not break all your wonderful designs. Currency. If you have currency in your application, then you can't just put dollar signs everywhere. You have to worry about euros and yen and anything else you might think of. And be really, really careful about assuming that because you're showing somebody the German interface, they want euros. A while, not too long ago, we had somebody who asked us for the Russian translation for a particular document that they wanted. And they wanted to use it in a particular location, a factory in North America that actually had a lot of Russian immigrants working there. So they had a bunch of Russians whose English wasn't very good, so they wanted to give them the Russian content instead because they figured they'd have an easier time reading it, right? Well, that was fine, except that the product that shipped to Russia was customized for the Russian market. And so as a result, the Russian documentation didn't actually match the US product. Those were not the same thing. So they had to do some localization work to have a Russian localization for the US machine. So, you know, things like that to think about. Your examples, when you write examples and you're having fun writing about Mickey Mouse, or you're using NASCAR examples or any number of other things that are very kind of culturally bound up in what you're doing. If I had this presentation and I talked about Old Bay, I think most of you that are Americans, North Americans, East Coasters would know what Old Bay seasoning is. It's a pretty well-known blend for seafood. But I've now lost my entire, you know, European, Asian, Indian, non-US audience, basically, right? So you have to be really careful with your cultural references and use examples that will make sense to everybody. So every language is going to require you to think about your terminology, your design, and your localization, right? Those kinds of cultural things that make it look as though your content is truly integrated in what you're doing. And with that, I think I'm done here, and I will turn it back over to Stefan, if he's still awake, and Matt, who should be still awake. It's a little earlier for you.
I still have daylight. I don't think Stefan can say the same.
I still have daylight.
We've had lots of, I just giggled recently with your Comic Sans reference. I got a kick out of that.
Yeah.
And then I also got a kick out of your yet another 5-step maturity model, which the acronym is now officially YAFSMM. So yeah, for short, you can use that.
That'll be helpful.